what I want to do is I want to describe how we know some of the large features of the global carbon cycle from observations and models. And I'll do it a little bit in a historical context. I sent Dave a book chapter, which is kind of it's a kind of a funny version of the Chalk Talk because it's specifically about forests, but most of the terrestrial stuff is about forests. That kind of walks through this narrative in sequential order so that you can refer back, because I hope nobody will take notes. So I'm going to do this, as I said, as kind of a timeline of ideas, a sort of an intellectual history or a description of discovery. And of course, it all starts out with Dave Keeling's observations of the carbon cycle at Mauna Loa. And they began in 1958, which, you know, if you think about it, it's really the dark ages, right? There are not really any computers. The weather forecast is done on paper. And Dave decides, under his mentor's guidance, Ravel, who had very big feet, I met him once, to measure CO2 at Mauna Loa. And the reason they did that is that the US Weather Bureau, which became NOAA much later, had a station there, and they thought it would be nice, clean air. But by the very early 1960s, two features of the carbon cycle had become evident. The first that became evident, the first thing that they were able to detect, was the seasonal cycle. And you know, if you search around on the web, you can find graphics in old reports that have like the first 2 years of data, just showing all the points. And it's just amazing, because by the end of the second year of data, you can tell that there's a seasonal cycle of CO2. I mean, it didn't take 10 years of observations for that to emerge. But by the early 1960s, they could see that, and it was really clear. No one could come up with any explanation for this other than the correct one, which is that this is the imprint of terrestrial vegetation on the atmosphere. So discovery one about the global carbon cycle is that the terrestrial biosphere plays some kind of a role in it. And that was a shocker. And actually, it took a long time for it really to be accepted, that the breathing of the Earth was really the terrestrial biosphere. Because at the time, ecology was really about very, very, very small scale things. And the earth sciences were completely dominated by atmospheric science, and even more perhaps by oceanography. And the carbon cycle was thought to be an interplay between the atmosphere and the oceans. Now, by 1958, people knew that fossil fuel emissions might be causing a change and could, in principle, cause a change in atmospheric concentrations, although there was the thought that all of that CO2 might actually be absorbed by the oceans. And in that area are Roger Revelle, Dave Keeling's postdoctoral mentor, Roger Revelle's great contributions, and I'm not going to talk about the Revelle factor. But by the time there were 3 or 4 years of data, in fact, really, if you look at the first 2 years of data, and you know that the atmospheric concentrations are increasing, you can see that they are. So, you know, by here, the data are beginning to form this sinusoidal pattern. And 1958 or 1960, I can't remember what the second full year of data is actually clearly higher than the previous year. Okay, now that's really interesting. First of all, it shows that there's a very strong and consistent increase in atmospheric concentrations. But it's also a tribute to Dave's incredible analytical ability. At the time, there was a large community making CO2 concentrations, and they were observing all of these variations, and they were concocting fantastic explanations for them. When they started calibrating their instruments against Dave's instruments, it turned out that everything they were seeing was instrumental error. It was all measurement error. So this entire Swedish program where carbon science really began, it's gone. It's lost on the dust heap of history, because all they were measuring was the effect of temperature on their instrument. Very sad story. They were great scientists. But they were not anal and persistent in the way that Dave Keeling was. Humanity would be extinct if many people were like Dave. But it would also be extinct if there were no people like Dave. So the second thing that happened the second really big landmark in this story was the realization that the increase in atmospheric CO2 could not account for all of the fossil fuel that was being burned. Now, we didn't know that very well, but we knew from industrial statistics, various sorts of reporting about how much fossil fuel was being burned. In fact, at that time, what we knew best was how much fossil fuel was being reported by the industry as being produced. So we had a pretty good sense that this curve ought to be up there, that it should be increasing roughly twice as fast as it was. And so the first discovery, really the one that you can see in the first 2 years of data, is the breathing of the Earth, the imprint of life on the global atmosphere. But the second phenomenon that was identified is that some of the fossil fuel carbon was not accumulating in the atmosphere. And at that point, people started doing a lot of calculations. Revell and Walter Munk and other oceanographers started trying to calculate the amount of CO2 that the oceans could take up. Well, it turns out that that calculation, it's a little bit like the doubling of CO2, the temperature thing, where actually when they did it over 100 years ago, they actually got about the right answer. Well, it turns out that for CO2 uptake by the oceans, likewise, even the very early calculations are very constrained by the area of the ocean, by the average wind speed, and by the average disequilibrium between atmospheric CO2 and ocean mixed layer CO2. And so fairly quickly on, certainly by the late 1960s, early 1970s, oceanographers, and remember that Dave Keeling is at an oceanographic institution, oceanographers are convinced by the late 60s, early 70s, that about half of this fossil fuel CO2, about half of this difference isn't going into the oceans. And as near as we can tell, even today with tracer oceanography, with sophisticated three-dimensional models, with bomb carbon tracers, we're pretty sure that they were right. So, if this is what CO2 ought to have been doing, about half of that drawdown is due to the oceans. And the other half is going somewhere else. And at some point, and I can't actually trace the origin, maybe Anker knows, the phrase, the missing sink, started to be used. When I left college and went to work at Woods Hole in 1977, the missing sink was like canonical. It was a very well-established term. So a lot of the framework of carbon science was already kind of in place by the late 1970s. Now, so just kind of making a timeline, we have the seasonal cycle, or the breathing of the Earth. Then, fairly quickly we have, where is the carbon going? 3, it's not in the oceans. But 4 is where ecology begins to come into play. Because about the time that oceanographers and atmospheric scientists started saying, well, there has to be a terrestrial sink, and it's probably due to increasing CO2, and they came up with this concept of the beta factor, which is the stimulation of photosynthesis by increasing CO2, and they fit this curve to the data and showed that you could very parsimoniously explain for this missing sink by just doing a little curve fitting without any Bayesian anything, with no data assimilation. We're talking more or less you linearize the data by transformation and do a linear regression, and problem goes away. Well, about that time, George Woodwell, who was in fact as stubborn and pig-headed as Dave Keeling, said, it's not that simple. The tropics are being deforested. Over the last 100 years, the mid-latitudes were largely deforested. Enormous areas of land are being cleared of forests. George loves forests. And he was passionately concerned about their disappearance. And he said, there's got to be another source term. There's got to be CO2 released from the deforestation of the forested lands of New England, of Europe, and at that time, beginning at that time, Brazil, Indonesia, Africa, and so on. And so, if you recall your sort of basic carbon cycle math, today fossil fuel emissions are sort of 8 to 9 gigatons, right? So in the late 1970s, fossil fuel emissions were sort of in the 4-ish range. There were estimates of deforestation in the literature, and by the literature I mean low visibility outlets like Science Magazine. There were estimates of the deforestation flux that ranged from 1 gigaton, which is actually about right, to 40 gigatons, right? And so I watched George Woodwell tell Roger Revelle that not only was his calculation of ocean uptake almost certainly wrong, which, by the way, George was not correct about, but that in fact the oceans might be taking up 40 times more carbon than his calculation allowed for, because it damn well wasn't in the atmosphere, and it was being released by the biosphere, and the beta factor, which George then beat the oceanographers with, the beta factor couldn't possibly account for getting rid of these 40 gigatons. And if it was, where were they going? Why weren't trees growing like, popsicles everywhere? So this was the nature of the carbon cycle debate, and believe me, that these were colorful characters with a lot of passion. It wasn't about saving the world at that point. So now we have an even more difficult problem, because we've got a missing sink because the oceans can't take up all the carbon, but we also have an extra source that in fact puts this curve somewhat higher. And so the fourth milestone is the recognition that there's a deforestation flux. And although there's a lot of literature on the deforestation debate, framing it, talking about it, putting it actually already in kind of an ethics and values context, the key paper that everyone in carbon science should read is Ski Houghton's 1983 paper in Ecology, where he did the first really thorough global model of deforestation. It was a bookkeeping model, but it's not just bookkeeping, because he built into it assumptions about how fast systems would recover carbon after they were being deforested, that were tuned to large observational data sets. They made a real strong effort to estimate what the pre-deforestation biomass might have been. I mean, they did everything right. And the number that they came up with, I mean, there's a range reported in the paper that is something like 1.5 to 4 gigatons of carbon released from deforestation. And it wasn't very precise, but it was rather accurate. And how has it been improved? Well, the area estimates of deforestation that were available in the 1980s were all government reporting data. They weren't based on actual observations, so they came through UN organizations. The estimates of biomass that were available in the literature there tended to be science-based estimates, so they tended to be biased high because they were typically at very pristine, very beautiful rainforest sites. And so when you actually look at the total distribution of biomass, it turns out to be a bit lower. It turns out that those government reported rates are not very accurate or precise. And remote sensing has really enabled us to change those. But again, the estimate was accurate, as was the early ocean estimate. So these are both saying, these kind of 2 to 4 numbers, right? Not very precise, but they're not wrong. The central tendency is kind of where we've begun to converge. It's not like what we're seeing now is outside even these very early estimates. So this is an error, and I make that point mainly to point out that really some of the very best minds in science have worked on the carbon cycle, even though it's almost always been marginalized in all of the disciplines that contribute to it. So, Dave was not really considered a member of the club by other oceanographers. Ski and George Woodwell have never been considered quite the done thing by many ecologists. But the very best people have been attracted to this problem. Often strangely obstinate and challenging people like Dave and George, and I didn't know Revelle well enough, but I don't imagine that he was a cream puff either. So coming into the 1980s, we had decent estimates of fossil fuel deforestation, ocean uptake, atmospheric accumulation, and we had a theory, and so if you balance these books, you wind up with a residual, which by that time was generally called the missing sink, which used to really piss terrestrial ecologists off. Because fossil fuel, well, that's a real thing. Deforestation, that's a good ecological term. Ocean uptake, absolutely, you know, piston velocities, disequilibria. Atmospheric accumulation, I mean, this had already gone platinum, right? This was a big deal. And then we had the missing sink. We didn't have terrestrial uptake or ecosystem biomass accumulation. We were just the residual. And I cannot tell you how many beers I had with people who railed about being the residual, right? Why is our discipline the residual? But we had a theory. Huh?
Have they seen our model projections? Of course we're the residual.
There were no model projections. But we had a theory for the missing sink. And the theory was the beta factor, the stimulation of biospheric carbon uptake through enhanced photosynthesis as a result of the increasing CO2 concentration. And by, let's say, 1990, this was not a cottage industry. This was a full-on department store. There were hundreds of people working on this. There were review papers. There were meta-analyses. Stellar reputations, faculty appointments at prestigious universities, massive sums of DOE money were going into. DOE funded this, by the way, because they thought it might make the whole fossil fuel problem go away. And pretty much when they figured out that really wasn't going to happen, they just walked away from it, which is a cautionary tale for all of those of us who depend on DOE funding. If you get the wrong answer, you don't get to try again. So the missing sink, a lot of debate about this, right? Because there's a well-developed theory for the beta factor. It's based on lots of experimental data. People are building phytotrons and growth chambers and doing lab experiments and very clever things in tunnels and all kinds of ways. And pretty much every experiment that's ever been done in the lab shows that if you give plants more CO2, they take up more carbon. Now, translating that into carbon storage was really challenging to ecosystem modelers, and it was really challenging to a subset of ecologists who thought that CO2 was probably not the primary limiting resource for plant growth in nature, and said, well, sure, if you put a plant in a pot and you fertilize it and you water it, and then you give it more CO2, it's going to grow more. But imagine that same plant subject to drought, nutrient limitation, defoliation by insects. It's probably not going to do as well. And so there was a big debate that really revolved around how limiting factors interacted. Okay, key paper summarizing all this work, and I don't actually remember the date of it, but it's in that manuscript I gave you, Dave, is a review paper in the now all but forgotten journal Bioscience, published by the American Institute of Biological Sciences, first authored by Hal Mooney. And Hal basically took this idea of resource limitation, and there's a wonderful figure in that paper that, you know, it's another one of those things, it may very well be right, but he had axes of resource limitation, you know, water, nutrients. And he attempted from theory and the literature to figure out which ecosystems would be most sensitive to CO2. And the systems that, you know, and so the punchline, and this figure is really worth looking at, the paper is really worth reading. You know, the punchline is that if CO2 fertilization is a powerful force, then its impact should be roughly proportional to primary productivity, because primary productivity is highest where resource limitation is lowest. Primary productivity is highest in systems that have adequate light, that have adequate moisture, that have adequate nutrients. Well, where is that? Where are those systems, right? Tropical rainforests. They have they have 12 months of growing season. They have lots of rain, so they have lots of moisture. And they actually tend to be very rich in nutrients to the point where some people think they're not nutrient limited at all, or they argue about whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus. Lots of nitrogen fixing species and so on and so forth. So point 5 is that the beta factor should be proportional to NPP. And that, coming into the late 80s, early 90s, sets up a hypothesis that the sink in the biosphere should scale, should be proportional, should be geographically distributed with patterns of primary productivity. And that theory that predicts that has never really been refuted. The only counter-argument to it is that actually CO2 fertilization should maybe be most effective in arid environments where it increases water use efficiency. That predicts a very different pattern, but it also predicts a very low global impact of CO2 fertilization. Because although you'd be potentially increasing productivity by 20 or 30% at doubled CO2, you'd be increasing a very low productivity in ecosystems that don't store a lot of carbon. And so that theory is laid out as well in the Mooney review paper, which I think is like actually 1992 or something like that. But the prevailing theory there is that CO2 fertilization is either low and mainly focused on water-stressed environments, which again aren't very productive, or it's proportional to net primary productivity. So I'm going to say that about 6 times, because what we've got set up now here is a hypothesis. A hypothesis that the terrestrial sink is a function of CO2 fertilization and that it's distributed in one of 2 geographic patterns. If it's the second geographic pattern, it probably doesn't amount to 1 to 2 gigatons of carbon uptake per year. And so now we get to do this annual ritual of the chalkboard flip. Okay, so so now we can be like real ecologists, and we can say H1 is that the missing sink is due to the beta factor, to CO2 fertilization, and the test is the geographic distribution, right? Is there a sink that appears to be globally distributed in a way that resembles net primary productivity? Okay, so I'm going to put this in a box here, and I'm going to go off on a completely different tangent. Jeff?
Sorry, what year do you think this hypothesis?
We're talking a debate that raged between, say, 1986 and 1992, 93, 94, 95. I'll tell you when it ended. I mean, it's never ended. It's still,
Right.
There's still blood on the floors of many university departments. But now I'm going to go into something completely different. So if there are any questions about how we got to this point, now would be a good time. Because now I'm going to start talking about atmospheric transport. So if you think about the world in a very simple way, from the perspective of an atmospheric scientist, you can think about the world as being 2 boxes, the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. And the reason that you can do that is that the interhemispheric exchange time is about 1 year. So to some extent, the atmospheres of the northern and the southern hemisphere are well mixed by the meridional circulations, but they're really not very tightly connected to each other. That is, the time constant of exchange is quite slow across the equator through the equatorial region. And if you want to get really fancy, you can turn this into a general circulation model with 1 million or 2 grid cells. But for many purposes, this 2-box model is a very good place to start. And this two-box model was first proposed, I believe, by the great Swedish meteorologist, polymath Bert Bolin, who later went on to found the IPCC. And so there's a paper that's extremely hard to find. It's like in the Nordic Journal of Numerical Weather Prediction or something like that, by Bert Bolin and a then extremely young American named Berrien Moore, where they proposed a two-box model of the global carbon cycle. And they said, well, look, most of the fossil fuel emissions come in the northern hemisphere. So there should be a concentration difference between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere because it takes a year to mix. And this is being driven by dCO2 dt greater than 0, right? So as long as this is continuing to increase, right, emissions are continuing and they're accelerating, then this hemisphere will always slightly lag the other hemisphere in terms of concentration. And again, this was a huge insight. The idea that you might be able to solve for some of these fluxes through a mass balance calculation modified by a transport model. And so I'm going to use this two-box model and this two-box analogy consistently. And this is where, you know, Scott and I spent a long time talking about how to teach this, including when he was a grad student. Because, you know, now we do this with a million lines of code and a supercomputer and giant groups. And the groups are part of metagroups that collaborate and compare and intercompare under the Transcom heading. But the reality is, much like that first calculation of ocean uptake, much like that first calculation of deforestation, the estimate that you get with a two-box model for a lot of these fluxes is not very precise, but it isn't wrong. It's pretty accurate. So, you know, again, going into depth here, the reason why there is a gradient of CO2 requires a post-calculus explanation. I'm not going to go through the derivation. But basically, it's because you have it's like the water going into a bathtub and leaking out kind of a thing. You're continually putting more in here. It's flowing to this box, but with a time delay. And it's the combination of the rate of change and the time delay that gives you a gradient of CO2 between the northern and the southern hemisphere. Now, on the observation side of the house, by the end of the 1990s, there were a fairly large number of long-term CO2 observing sites distributed around the world, many fewer than there are today, but enough to characterize the pattern of CO2 between the hemispheres. And many of these were run by US scientists. Dave Keeling's group at Scripps had a number of sites at Scripps itself, at the South Pole, at Barrow. NOAA had developed a CO2 program. I think that the feds actually began taking over CO2 observations, actually, I believe in the late 1960s. So there'd been a US government supported activity headquartered in Boulder, I think, from its inception. And so by the late 80s, there are sort of 20 stations. There are a couple of ship tracks, so there are these commercial ships that very repetitively go back and forth between one place and another, carrying fuel or cars or containers or something like that. Some of those ships were instrumented, so they provided some coverage of the southern hemisphere where there's not a whole lot of land. Obviously, Mauna Loa is kind of sitting right in the middle of this. And so building on this concept, people started thinking that from the spatial distribution of CO2, we might be able to learn something about the distribution of sources and sinks. Now, there are a couple of other things that are critical to know going on at the same time. The first is that in response to those initial early findings about ocean uptake, oceanographers made a major industry out of measuring sea surface CO2. And one guy, Taro Takahashi, started collating all that data, and he still does. So this is not a field where people have flash-in-the-pan careers. And so Taro's been accumulating all this data, but by the late 1980s, he can make a global map of CO2 concentrations. And from that, he can calculate the global disequilibrium. So where is atmospheric CO2 very high in relation to ocean peak CO2, ocean partial pressure of CO2, meaning that the ocean will take up CO2. Where is the ocean supersaturated with respect to the atmosphere, meaning where will it release CO2 back to the atmosphere? We have some understanding of the conveyor belt circulation that over hundreds or thousands of years moves carbon around in the oceans. But we know a lot now about the spatial pattern of the phenomenon that controls ocean CO2 uptake and release. And from that, we can build spatially explicit, observationally constrained, minimally modeled estimates of ocean CO2 uptake. So that's, so we now have globally distributed atmospheric CO2 data, globally distributed ocean partial pressure of CO2 data, global wind data, which you need to do to close that ocean uptake calculation. And so and we have this inverse modeling concept. So we've talked a little bit about inverse modeling, but it's an important concept. And the actual concept is very simple. The concept of inverse modeling is that an inverse model is a model where the order of mathematical operations is in the opposite direction from causation. Does that make sense? So let me tell you, you saw several talks. In fact, the entire day was in some sense talking about inverse modeling. But the example I'll give is we know about atmospheric concentration changes. And from those concentration changes, and I'll just give you a little preview of where we're going, from those concentration changes, we're going to try and compute fluxes. Now today we were talking about measuring fluxes and trying to compute parameters, right? Do concentrations cause fluxes? No. The fluxes cause the concentration changes. So when we're estimating fluxes from concentrations, or when we're estimating parameters from fluxes, our mathematical computation, our mathematical actions are going in the opposite direction of physical world, real world causation. Now you'll read lots of other definitions of inverse modeling. There's a whole theory of geophysical inverse techniques. There's some very exciting math in those books. I highly recommend Ian Enting's book on geophysical inverse techniques. I recommend that you set aside roughly a year to study his book. But he was kind of my mentor in this area, and this is his definition. And it's a very good definition. So we have these pieces now. We have the concept of inverse modeling, which again, for the carbon cycle, was pioneered by Bolin. We have global atmospheric data. And we have global ocean data. And, oops, we have a residual. So again, we have a bunch of pieces. And just really echoing the theme of this course, we have models and we have data, and we have to use them together to figure out what's going on. And remember that we also have a hypothesis. So in 1990, Tansfung and Takahashi published their paper, which is now known as Tansfung and Takahashi, or TFT, in those annoying papers where people make initials into acronyms. And it was published in Science. I believe it to be one of the most cited papers in the history of Science magazine. It is amongst the 10 most cited papers in all of our sciences. And it deserves all of that because it really reshaped our view of what was going on, and it formed both a conceptual and a methodological foundation. And it's probably, the first example of measurements that are made as far as possible from anything living using protocols that are intended to eliminate as many of the local influences of biology as possible. It's probably the only time, or the first time, that data like that completely reshaped the science of ecology. And so here's the story. This is north, this is south, and this is CO2. And what I'm going to plot here are just differences from the global mean value of CO2. So the values on here go from, let's say, -4 to perhaps +4. So that's the size of the interhemispheric gradient, right? It's just a few parts per million. So we're measuring differences of a few parts per million between the North Pole, the South Pole, and the equator. And so I just kind of want to revert back to talking about how important observations are to our science, right? In 1958, it was unthinkable that you could continuously, constantly, and consistently maintain a measurement database of that accuracy and precision, such that after 10 or 20 years, you could plot the data and start to look seriously at differences of a few parts per million, right? I mean, think of that as a percentage, right? In very few terrestrial biogeochemical applications would you ever make much of concentration differences, between nitrate of, let's say, 0.003% or something like that. Again, this was built on Dave's development of an extremely stable, accurate, and precise methodology, incredible traceability of a continuous analyzer back to an absolute measurement of CO2 concentration, and his amazing ability to persuade everybody in the world to then reference their data to that set of traceable standards. And so as a result, he is the hero of neon, and we all worship at his shrine. So the interhemispheric gradient looks something like this. It's higher in the northern hemisphere. Concentrations are higher in the northern hemisphere, and we know that that is because fossil fuel is released predominantly over land in wealthy developed nations, which happen to lie in the northern hemisphere. And that leads to all kinds of global geopolitical hell, which is the subject of another talk by someone from a different discipline. And so what Tansfung and Takahashi did, really what Inez did, because she's the modeler and the analyst, is they started trying to model this distribution of CO2 concentrations. They took out the seasonal cycle, they took out the trend, and they started saying, okay, how can we explain these patterns constrained, one, by the mass balance of fossil fuel emission, deforestation estimates, ocean uptake estimates, and so on. Constrained first by those budget terms. Constrained second by the Takahashi, thus the TFT, constrained by the Takahashi ocean. But now, going beyond the two-box Bolin type model, Bolin and Moore type model, going beyond that, they started using what was then a pretty new capability in atmospheric models of following the transport of a substance. So, coming into this time period, atmospheric models simulated the weather. Climate models were very much just weather models run for a long time. But people had started worrying about atmospheric chemistry, about pollution, and so they developed the mathematical ability to carry tracers around in these models. And so Tansfung and Takahashi could now use a three-dimensional model of the global atmosphere. They could, in effect, inject CO2 into this atmosphere. They could inject, if you will, or deject or something, CO2 out of this atmosphere. But they could also simulate the fate of the CO2 as it blew around in the atmosphere, following the equations of motion and obeying equations, really quite simple equations, for the conservation of a tracer like CO2. Because CO2 does not react in the atmosphere. It's not like ozone that goes through multitudinous chemical reactions, and it can be created or destroyed anywhere. CO2 just sits in the atmosphere, a little of it leaks into the stratosphere, but otherwise it just exchanges with the ocean and the land. It's chemically inert in the atmosphere. In fact, when I first moved to NCAR, I had all kinds of hell because the climate division didn't think that a chemical, a compound, was climate, but the chemistry division didn't think that something that was not photochemically reactive was chemistry. And so the carbon cycle program got tossed back and forth over the course of the 1990s between the climate division and the chemistry division before finally winding up in the facilities division, where it remains largely to this day. Happy as a clam, because we're all carbon cycle guys, we're all kind of observational at heart. So what happened next was really interesting, because if you read the Tansfung and Takahashi paper, what you'll see in figure maybe 3 is a family of curves, none of which fit the data. You know, and again, I think that Mike talked about this. Ecology has a long tradition of suppressing all model errors and excluding them from publications. But the earth sciences have a long and I think more illustrious history of saying, hey, our model doesn't fit the data. That's actually really interesting, and publishing it. And basically, if you look again at Tansfung and Takahashi, you'll see this wonderful table where they lay out 4 or I think eventually 6 or 7 scenarios where they explore different deforestation rates, different ocean uptake dynamics, and they show that none of those hypotheses can fit the data, right? So they reject the hypothesis that the oceans are absorbing all of the CO2. They reject the hypothesis that deforestation is 0. They reject a number of out there hypotheses. But the really, really, really disturbing hypothesis that they reject is of a large sink in the tropics. Because whenever they put a sink in the tropics, they cannot fit the observed concentrations of CO2 in the tropics. In other words, the atmosphere does not believe the Mooney hypothesis. The atmosphere thumbs its nose at the Mooney hypothesis. It says, no, they are not. They are not taking up CO2. And yeah, we put deforestation in. We know that there's a source there. But if we put the source there and we put a sink there, guess what? We get the wrong answer. And the only hypothesis that they were able to develop that was consistent with the atmospheric data, with the oceanic data, with what was known about atmospheric transport, now a model, a real model, a quite complex, computationally expensive model, was a sink in the northern hemisphere. Because these hypotheses didn't just fail. They failed in a very consistent way. They failed in a way that suggested that there was not enough uptake in the northern hemisphere. So if you look at these lines, what you will consistently see is that the scenarios that don't involve northern hemisphere terrestrial uptake project concentrations in the northern hemisphere, in that right-hand box of the 2-box model, that are too high. And they are so high that you cannot explain them by tweaking ocean uptake. There's just not enough ocean up there, right? And there's tons of ocean data in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. Much, much more data, much higher density of data than in the Southern Ocean. So if we know anything about the ocean, it's ocean uptake in the Northern Hemisphere. And we can't explain the discrepancy between the model results and the observations by trying to stuff it into the oceans. And so Tansfung and Takahashi and then Fung et al. In a follow-on JGR paper, which is actually much easier to follow because it's longer and less telegraphic, they wind up concluding that there has to be a large sink of order not much less than a gigaton, not much more than 2 gigatons. There has to be a sink of carbon in the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes. And in fact, they don't get really good results if they try and put it into boreal or tundra ecosystems. Now, I would argue, and I think they would have argued, that they didn't have enough precision in this analysis to really say anything about the high northern latitudes with a great deal of confidence. But they were very clear that this northern hemisphere mid-latitude sink was the hypothesis that best fit the data. So there are a bunch of elements to this whole story, and I want to pause and just sort of go over some of those elements before I finish up with the conclusions. The first is that we're looking at an absolutely classic, a beautiful example of model data integration. This analysis couldn't have been done without both models and data. It built on sustained observations, not short-term process studies, not grant duration activities, but Keeling and Tance's entire careers of measuring CO2 around the world and ensuring the quality of those data, Takahashi's lifelong effort of integrating CO2, and the literally thousands of oceanographers who made and then contributed those observations. So these were also open data, except for Tance was kind of a dog in the manger about the CO2 data, but after the paper was published, he released it. So this is it's an amazing example of the kind of science that's more and more common today. It's a big data example. It's a model data fusion example. It leans very heavily on open data and open source science. And it's framed explicitly, if you read the paper, very clearly in a hypothesis testing mode. Now, many people think that modelers don't test hypotheses. We just model stuff and say, look, on it is good. But this is one of the biggest modeling papers ever, and it's one of the most classically framed hypothesis testing studies that you'll ever find. And not all modeling follows that, but it's a very clear demonstration that it works. Now, where I want to end up is by saying this completely turned ecology upside down, because for 10, 15 years, people had been debating how big the CO2 fertilization effect was. And the alternative hypothesis that ecologists were tacitly putting out there was that oceanographers didn't know what they were doing, right? So now all of a sudden we've got strong evidence of an ecosystem sink, and it isn't where our theory would have put it. It is neither in the tropics where NPP is concentrated, nor is it in arid lands, which are also actually in the tropics. So it doesn't follow either of the theories for a significant CO2 fertilization effect. And all of a sudden you have the whole community going, why are the mid-latitudes taking up carbon? So I can tell you the answer. The long discovery process is really a story for another day. But the answer is, well, because we deforested them and they're growing back. So it isn't really a sink, it's really just tit for tat, right? It's carbon that we released to the atmosphere between roughly 1850 and 1950, and some, probably not all of that carbon, is being taken up again by forests that are regrowing after they were harvested. And that hypothesis was first proposed by my working group in the 1995 IPCC carbon cycle assessment. It's subsequently been evaluated. It's very difficult to test or evaluate because it's so diffuse. But there's a whole string of papers by me, by Steve Pacala, by Ski Houghton and others that show that, yeah, you can accommodate a fairly substantial mid-latitude sink based on land use. Now, the thing that I want to leave you with is one more paper, which is Stevens 2005. Because what Britt Stevens did, also in Science magazine, Carbon Science is a good CV builder, is he said, well, let's redo this calculation, but now let's include airborne data. So all of the CO2 data that's done here, it's all collected at the surface. And we know that CO2 is distributed vertically through the atmosphere. And in particular, we know that a lot of really complicated atmospheric stuff happens in the tropics, including essentially a fast elevator shaft from the land and ocean surface, more or less to the tropopause. And so Britt said, well, gee, I wonder what will happen to the answer if we include observations that are taken aloft. And oops, it turns out that the models that fit both the surface data and the airborne data suggest a tropical sink, which is now a tenable hypothesis, very difficult to study. I would have said 5 years ago when Britt sent me the draft of this manuscript to review that this mid-latitude sink was as nailed down as anything in the carbon cycle. And it is. These models do not exclude a terrestrial mid-latitude sink, but they do suggest that there may be more tropical uptake that we've been accounting for. Now, estimates of deforestation are also much lower for the late 2000s than they were for the 1980s and the 1990s. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the carbon cycle. But again, it's this constant interplay between observations, models, and what I'll call theory and hypotheses. It's really science done almost the way it's taught in high school science classes, which, at least in my experience, doesn't happen very often, where you actually set up hypotheses and you test them. In the case of the carbon cycle, typically in very, very clever ways that involve lots of other people going to the field, airplanes, ships, planes, trains, automobiles, and so on and so forth. But this has been, this is one of the really, I think, amazing stories of scientific discovery. It's involved hundreds or thousands of people. I have not at all done justice to the modeling side of the house. Ankur talked about the inner comparisons of global process models. That's informed this discussion a lot. The land use story is much richer than I've given it credit for. So these are just the bare bones of how we've come to where we are now in thinking about the global carbon cycle. But I want to step back and take just a few more minutes and ask, why the hell does it matter what terrestrial carbon uptake is, why it's being taken up, or where it's being taken up? And the reason is because, again, of what Ankur discussed earlier today. Feedbacks between climate change and the terrestrial carbon cycle and the ocean carbon cycle roughly double the uncertainty about future climates that you get just from physical mechanisms. Physical mechanisms, the cloud feedback, aerosols, ocean heat uptake, things like that, give you about this much uncertainty. When you add the interactive effects of those climate changes with the carbon cycle, you just about double that uncertainty. So if you want to think about that, doubling the uncertainty of terrestrial uptake, which is a gigaton or two, or let's say 15% of global fossil fuel emissions. Well, 15% of global fossil fuel emissions is more or less 15% of global economic activity. So if we are wrong about what the carbon cycle climate feedback is going to do in the future, it will have an economic impact, if you will, on the one hand, if we have to further mitigate it, equivalent to 15% of the global economy. On the other hand, if we don't mitigate it, we could be 1 degree higher global mean temperature than we were shooting for, which may exceed critical thresholds. So understanding what the land and the ocean are doing in the global carbon cycle is as important to understanding what kind of a world we're going to have in the future as anything inner system science. It isn't more important than aerosols or ozone or oceans, but it is as important. It's not secondary as ecology was thought to be at the beginning of this great debate, where the land was thought to be, well, it's only 25% of the planet's surface, it doesn't have a lot of heat capacity, it can't do much. So we come out of this with a realization that the science that we're doing to understand the sensitivity of the global carbon cycle to the various forces, deforestation, reforestation, climate, and so on, is incredibly important. And again, we're building on the legacy, really, I think, of some of the most brilliant scientists who've ever really worked in any discipline. So that's where I want to end up. Thanks.